Hi everyone, and welcome to the PASS Marathon, the new world of data privacy. We're excited you could join us today for Grant, Matt, and Chris's keynote session, 10 Steps You Can Take to Be Compliant Worldwide. This PASS Marathon features back-to-back live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the PASS community. The sessions will be recorded and posted online after the event, and you will receive an email letting you know when the recordings will become available. My name is Louise Thomason, and I'm the Redgate Virtual Events Coordinator. I just have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Grant, Matt, and Chris. So just a few technical points. If you require technical assistance, please type your request into the question pane located on the right-hand side of your screen, and someone will assist you. The question pane is also where you may ask any questions during the presentation, so please feel free to enter your questions at any time and they will be addressed throughout the presentation. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. And please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session, which will pop up after the session ends in your web browser. Your feedback is really important to us for future events, so please do take a moment to complete this. As part of our Data Privacy Week with PASS and Redgate, look out for the new episode of Redgate's podcast DBAL coming on Friday. DBAL 12, Around the World in 80 Data Privacy Laws, gives you an entertaining and informative overview of what we've learned this week, and they will also be announcing the winner of our data privacy content, to make sure you tune in. This PASS Marathon session is presented by Grant Fritchey, PASS President and Microsoft Data Platform MVP, who joins us from Boston, and Matt Hilbert, Technology Writer, and Chris Unwin, Data Privacy and Protection Specialist, who are tuning in from Cambridge, UK. This keynote is the latest in a long week of series of events run by Redgate and PASS. We've already had a panel discussion on the GDPR effect and what happened since it came into force 1 year ago, a case study showing how PASS addressed global data privacy issues, and a Facebook Live session giving insights into data privacy and protection. Be sure to visit the Redgate Data Privacy Week webpage tomorrow to access the essential compliance learning, and that's www.red-gate/Data Privacy Week. Today, we'll be talking about the new world of data privacy we've all now come to be a part of, and outlining 10 steps you can take to be compliant worldwide. And tomorrow, we'll be launching our new white paper, the Global Data Privacy Roadmap, which explains those 10 steps in more detail. So, that's enough from me. So without further ado, here is Grant, Chris, and Matt's keynote session, 10 Steps You Can Take to Be Compliant Worldwide.
Thanks, Louise. This is Matt in Cambridge, and I'm here with Chris.
Hello.
Now, the agenda for today, 1 year on from the introduction of the GDPR across Europe, we've been looking at what's been happening in other countries around the world, and even individual states in the US. That's because there's been a huge ripple effect going on with the impact of the GDPR spreading across countries as diverse as Brazil and India, China and New Zealand. As a result, anyone who collects, stores or processes personal data almost anywhere is seeing big changes in terms of what they can and can't do with that data. And that will affect the way every data professional works. So today's agenda will cover what prompted the GDPR, how it's affected the way that we work with data, and other legislation that is being introduced in the US and elsewhere. It will then cover, importantly, the 10 steps you can take to be compliant anywhere and the advantages to be gained by doing so. Now, it's timely because for years, decades even, DBAs and data professionals have been, well, they've been left to get on with it. Grant in Boston, you've been a DBA for a long time now, so can you set the scene for us and give us some idea of the way data privacy has been handled up until now? What was expected from DBAs, for example, in the days before the GDPR? Was data protection even a big thing? Was it on the daily DBA checklist?
So they're going to have the old guy talk about the old ways of doing data privacy and data protection. Now, back in the day, it really kind of depended upon your organization completely. There wasn't the legislation to force us to do things a certain way. So some organizations, by design, intentionally let full-blown production data go into non-production environments. This is just a standard approach to doing the work. And yes, we've done horrible things because of it. I was involved in sending out email to an entire customer list as part of a test. Not that I did it, but that I provided that data to a developer who did that work. And it's just not acceptable anymore. But back then it was acceptable, except when mistakes happened. So as time went on and as IT matured and organizations matured, they then put in place scripting and different methodologies, that would protect in those non-production environments. Now, we still frequently had cases where, say, a development team wanted to do testing against production data, so we had a secondary server that had a full copy of production, so they still had full access to that information, even though we made sure that we weren't sending out emails to everyone. However, over time, what you saw was more and more scripts put in place that would allow you to move databases into non-production environments. It was a very tedious and slow process. It involved lots and lots of time. And that's the worst part of it, is it involves so much time. The effort to create the scripts, the effort to maintain the scripts, and then frankly the time it took to run all the scripts, to clean all the data prior to going to non-production environments was very, very time intensive. Now, the opposite direction sometimes worked better, but not great, and that was to build fake data. And you would build that up in your non-production environments and have that available, and it would be much smaller, much faster, but also much less representative of what the production environment looked like. And therefore, when we were doing testing for pre-deployments before getting out to our production environment, we saw, successful deployments, and then we would go to production and find out that either, wow, the deployment that was taking us 5 minutes in non-production environments is going to now take 5 hours, or the production deployment failed. And so the old days were very rough, ready, and shoddy. It involved lots and lots of manual labor, very little bits of automation, and frankly, lots of error and problems.
Thanks, Grant, for that valuable glimpse into how DBAs worked in the past. Things are different now, of course, because data privacy has moved from the back room to the boardroom. But that's not actually down to the GDPR. The shift predates that and was brought about by changes in the way data is collected, stored and used, and misused. And the big one, data breaches. So let's look at each one of those in turn. Firstly, we've now entered the zettabyte era, with data growth forecasts quadrupling the amount of data we handle between now and 2025, at which time it's estimated to be 160 zettabytes. A zettabyte, by the way, is 1 billion terabytes. So that's a lot of data being handled by a lot of companies. What that data is stored for, though, is also important. You might be thinking, for example, that it's down to streaming services like Netflix or other content platforms like YouTube. As you can see, it's not. Half of those 160 zettabytes in 2025 are forecast to be filled with data belonging to and being used by enterprises. That's you, that's us. So there's a lot of data out there being stored. And then, of course, there's data misuse. That's what's been grabbing public attention everywhere, because it's become a currency, personal data, and it was being freely traded by many companies, often without consent. The Facebook Cambridge Analytica story, for example, was just the pinnacle of the way data has been misused. And yes, the picture of Mark Zuckerberg speaking at Facebook's annual conference last month is meant to be ironic. He now says the future is private, and Facebook announced just a week or so ago that it's suing analytics firm RankWave over alleged data misuse. all of which sounds good, but at the same time, Facebook also said last month that it was setting aside $3 billion to cover the potential costs of an investigation by US authorities into its privacy practices. So this whole privacy thing is becoming expensive, very expensive, when data is misused. Now, along with the misuse of data come the data breaches that we seem to read about every other day. My favorite source of the causes of breaches is the Identity Theft Research Center. They've been tracking data breaches since 2007, and that orange line at the top of this chart of different kinds of data breaches is, as you might expect, hackers. Up until 2017, hacking was the biggest cause of data breaches. No surprise there. But take a look at what happened from 2017 onwards. Hacking started to come down, remember that's the orange line, but unauthorized access from contractors and third parties, the blue line, went up markedly, and employee errors and accidental exposures, that's the green and yellow lines, they also rose. Why? It looks like companies are getting their ducks in a row when it comes to cybersecurity measures like network security, but falling down when it comes to internal security measures like restricting data access. Now, given the timing of this change, that may well be a result of the introduction of the GDPR itself. Companies, businesses, organizations, they knew they had to do something. So they naturally turned to an area they broadly understood and already had solutions in place for: network security. Beef it up, encourage people to change passwords once a month, check access privileges, and so on. All of which is good and should be done anyway, but it still leaves all of that data sitting there inside the business, often in unsecure environments. Having a copy of the production database in test and dev, for example. That said, now is probably a good time to remind ourselves of what practices the GDPR expects companies and organizations to adopt when handling data, as Chris will now explain.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Matt. Now, obviously the GDPR has been around for some time, and it's quite difficult for us to have a full understanding of exactly what the GDPR means for companies. Now, I've put up here the kind of main points, the actual key takeaways, the pillars of the GDPR, as it were. So lawfulness, fairness, transparency, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitations, and integrity and confidentiality. But what does it mean in practice? Well, unlike some people, I'm a big fan of a bit of bedtime reading. So of course, once I got my hands on the GDPR, I was like, oh, fantastic, I'll read through this. And then I realized quite how long it was. Well, fortunately, as data professionals, there are a few key elements to the GDPR that really speak out to us. Now, the first one I wanted to pull out isn't so much around the actual data side of things, but it's something I wanted to point out anyway, and that was Article 25, paragraph 2. Now, that particular article says that data protection by design and by default. Okay, that's the title, as it were, of that particular article, and it's a really interesting concept. I don't know if anyone out there has a favorite aspect of any data protection legislation, but this is my absolute key favorite phrase. And the way they typify that is: the controller shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures for ensuring that, by default, only personal data which is necessary for each specific purpose of the processing is processed. Now, that's a mouthful. What does it actually mean in English? Well, it kind of basically says that we just need to make sure that at every single stage of handling all this sensitive, personally identifiable information, and that's a key definition all in itself, is data that relates to an individual or a household or any one of these. But actually how that's being processed at every single stage, we just need to bake data protection in from the very ground up. Now, we've got all of these processes, as Grant said, which we've had in place for some time and which are gradually evolving with, adding bits on, taking bits away. But actually, how do we ensure that at the very heart of all of these processes that our business uses for day-to-day business, for delivering value to customers, how do we make sure that they have data protection by design and by default at their very heart? Now, another one I wanted to pull out is more around the actual people. So not so much the companies don't have to worry about this, but actually what do the people have now the ability to do under the GDPR? Well, the primary thing that a lot of people take away, yes, there's the whole access to data and ensuring that data is up to date. But the main thing, and I've even done one of these myself, and that's actually Article 17, which is the right to be forgotten. The actual rights of the data subject to say to a company, wherever I exist in all of your systems, that needs to go away forever, unless I then re-give you my consent to store and process that data. So the actual wording is, the data subject shall have the right to obtain from the controller the erasure of personal data concerning him or her without undue delay, and the controller shall have the obligation to erase personal data without undue delay. Now, again, there are a whole host of different time frames involved, and if you make a subject access request of a company, again, much like I did, you then have the ability to wait, I think it's like 30 days or so, and then the company has to get back to you telling you exactly how they got your data in the first place, when the consent was granted to them to store it, where they store it, how they use it, and then you have the ability to say, forget me, just get rid of it. Now, for businesses, for data professionals, this is a huge headache. It's quite fortunate that as subjects, we can actually say, well, hey, guess what? All of my data gone. But flip that on its head and think about it from a DBA's perspective. I've got all of this data that exists, well, all over the show, exists in all of these different places. How can I be sure that I am indeed sticking to what is now expected of me? How can I be completely sure that I'm actually erasing all of this data? It's a tricky one and a big, big headache. But again, the GDPR is about protecting individuals. So even if you are the DBA or the person responsible for this, that applies to you as well. It's protecting your data, and that's at the very heart of the GDPR, and that's why it's so early on in the actual legislation itself. Now, we're getting kind of down into the nitty-gritty, as it were. There is another one, Article 32, kind of when it concerns data processing, and there are a couple of different paragraphs in this particular article which are really, really helpful and kind of fit into this quite nicely. And the first one, Article 32, paragraph 1, it actually kind of specifies some of the methods that should be used to help you protect this data where you have it at rest. You've got paragraph 1A, the pseudonymization and encryption of personal data. Okay, that kind of makes sense. It's not telling us exactly what kind of pseudonymization or encryption we should be using. It's all perfectly well and good to be saying, yes, I encrypt my data, but if you're encrypting your data with a very outdated algorithm, or you're not protecting it kind of well enough, then actually the scale of that encryption isn't quite enough to justify that processing and that storage. So although it specifies it, and this is a key thing, you'll notice that the GDPR, very grey. So there's a whole lot of interpretation to be taken from it. So the other part was C, the ability to restore the availability and access to personal data in a timely manner in the event of a physical or technical incident. Now, this is also a really tricky one, because we basically talk backups all the time, and everyone worth their salt is creating database backups. We're looking after our data, we're backing it up, we're making sure for our own company's kind of disaster recovery policies that we're protecting it, we're keeping it aside, it's all good. But then data protection comes into the fray with data retention, and we'll get to that in a minute. But how long are we holding on to these backups for? And then we have this whole other question of, well, actually, if I need to hold on to this data to respond in a timely manner to a physical or technical incident, how long do I hold onto it for? And if I hold onto it too long, is that unconsented processing? It's not an easy thing to argue. So that kind of follows on with paragraph 4. And paragraph 4 in Article 32 was that the controller and processor shall take steps to ensure that any natural person acting under the authority of the controller or the processor who has access to personal data does not process them except on instruction from the controller. Now, this very quickly goes back to exactly what you were saying, Matt, which was about giving access to data to people. And it's all very well and good if you say, we have got these systems and we need to work on these systems. But when we're moving sensitive production level data back into pre-production, where we potentially have developers, third parties, contractors, moving data around, again, we'll get to that, but where we've got all these things happening with that data, and we're telling people to do that, now this paragraph specifically is saying to us, we actually shouldn't give access to these people to have access to that data. You know, we shouldn't let them just work on it unless there are specific and defensible reasons for doing so. So we want to give developers and third parties access to this data so they can do their wonderful work. You know, devs produce the most amazing stuff, delivering that value up to customers. And that's what helps a business grow. And we all want to grow as companies. But is this saying then that we can't then move that data back? In which case, are we then hindering further the ability of these developers to deliver that value? A really interesting point to bear in mind, something that definitely affects us as professionals. The final thing I wanted to focus on as well, I mean, it's all been very kind of focused around what people can ask of your company, what your company should or should not be doing. But actually, I speak to, you know, not just Redgate customers, but people all around the globe about these specific things at all times. And something that comes up quite often is actually the transfer of data. So actually, are we dealing with third parties who take copies of our database, for instance? Do we have maybe some third party, I don't know, analytics company that we want to pass our data over to, completely legally, of course. But if we want to pass that data over for them, we have to start asking ourselves even more questions. Now, Article 46, paragraph 1, a controller or processor may transfer personal data to a third country or an international organization only if the controller or processor has provided appropriate safeguards and on condition that enforceable data subject rights and effective legal remedies for data subjects are available. Now, again, what does that mean in English? Well, it means we can only send data to people to work on it if there are the appropriate technical measures in place, whether that be encrypting the data, pseudonymizing the data, etc., calling back to that, or actually, does that call into the question, do we need to transfer this data to that third party in the first place? Could this be damaging to companies' business models where they're processing data from around the world? Suddenly we're asking questions of ourselves where in the past, we've not had to worry too much. If we give our data to someone and they have a data breach, that's on them. That's their bad. And they are the ones who suffer the consequences. But now it's about joint liability. It's about everyone actually facing up to this particular problem and actually saying, well, we didn't do enough. It's not enough to say that they didn't do enough because now we're all going to feel the sting. So that's just a brief kind of run through of the GDPR there, and actually just pulling out a few very data specific clauses. I may have missed some, absolutely. There is a ton of really useful information. Now, if you get the opportunity to read said GDPR, then actually that would be great. But actually, I want to finish off with just one final point, as it were. So I called earlier to data storage, and this is the one I pulled out first. This is kind of my primary go-to. And this was actually not any of the articles in particular, it was actually recital 39. Now, recital 39 states that the period for which the personal data is stored should be limited to a strict minimum and that time limits should be established by the data controller for deletion of the records. Now, this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is, well, if we need to respond to an event where we have to restore sensitive data, well, if we're not holding on to sensitive data, then we can't do that. So it's almost like they're fighting with one another. They're at loggerheads, one thing saying another, one thing saying something else. But data retention policies, something that people have kind of in a blanket across businesses, you know, what is our default business data retention policy? Maybe 90 days. Maybe we keep a backup for 90 days and then it goes away. But perhaps now we actually have to start looking at it in a more granular level. It's not just where we're putting our data, it's how long we're holding that data there. So actually, it's time we started looking at our processes, almost like data protection by design and default. Well, I'm not going to say, but it is important to look at these processes from the very ground up, as I said at the beginning, and that is what the GDPR aims to do. It helps us look at our processes and it gives us that guidance, but it is a grey area. It's not possible to be compliant with this piece of legislation. It is not it's not a checkbox. It's not like ISO 27001 where we can go, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. Huzzah, we are fine. What it actually is a set of guidelines that tell us, well, actually, build a defensible position. And again, we'll come to this a little bit later, but if you build up your sand mound that you stand on top of, you can then more easily see threats incoming. It's about having that higher ground, and the higher you build that ground, the more you prepare, well, then the better off you'll be. And even if you do suffer a data breach, even under the GDPR, if you have a defensible position, then it doesn't mean that the fallout from that is going to be as bad. So whilst this has all been going on in the EU, many companies in places like the US have actually been looking on thinking, well, it's not my problem. But that's all about to change. Grant's actually going to tell us what's been happening in the US since the GDPR was introduced.
Happy to talk about the US. Now, don't forget, GDPR does apply to US companies if you're collecting EU citizens' data while they are in the EU. So don't think that GDPR does not apply to you. It really can, depending on the situation that you're in. But let's talk about US laws. We have several laws that are directly impacting privacy and compliance. First up is Sarbanes-Oxley. It's probably the least interesting one, but it's still there. There are some privacy and compliance regulations within it. But the more interesting ones come in with HIPAA. So healthcare information. You know, what kind of medicines are you taking? Have you been diagnosed with things? You know, how many times do you see a doctor? All this kind of stuff. These are private information that you can go to prison for releasing. So there are fines associated and all kinds of other issues. So we have, at least within a narrow range of healthcare information, a very strict set of requirements that we have to meet. But it doesn't end there. We also have stuff like PCI, which is a banking regulation that requires us to keep track of credit card information and not release that to non-authorized people, not to leak it out. I mean, there's all kinds of issues you can hit from the banks. This isn't government driven, this is bank driven, so it's probably more scary, and we need to keep track of that. In addition, we have FERPA, which is the Federal Education Privacy Act, and that requires us to track student information. Now, not just little kids, minors. We'll talk about that in a second. But no, college level, college age, my age, if I went back to school, it doesn't matter. If you're in the education environment, you've got protected data that you're going to have to deal with on a regular basis. So all of these are coming our way, but that doesn't end. We are also looking at GDPR style laws. There are at least 11 different states, at least the last time I looked, that are looking at exploring, maybe even implementing GDPR style laws. Now, the first one that comes up is the California Privacy Act. That one has already passed. It is already a law. Enforcement begins January 1. You're going to have to ensure that you're protecting clients' data who are in California or from California. If you're collecting their data while they're in California, depending on the size of your organization, you now have this protection regime applying to you in January 1, 2020. So you've only got a few months to actually get in compliance with this law. So I would get on that. We're also looking at stuff like the Washington State was working on a law. New York State had a shield law. The Washington State law looks like it may not pass. It's still unclear to me what happened with this last legislation thing. I keep reading the news, but still no information there. But there's a whole bunch of other laws coming. Further, there are at least 2 bills being introduced in the one in the House and one in the Senate for a GDPR style law at a national level here in the States. Now, the chances of this stuff getting passed anytime soon is very, very low. The indications on whether or not it's going to survive, contact with the lobbyists is unclear, but this stuff is coming to the United States. Further, we've got something sponsored, Democrat Ed Markey from Massachusetts and Republican Josh Hawley from Missouri have put together the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act. And this one is probably going to come out and get passed. It's because, they want to protect the information from minors, from young children, and, who most of all need privacy protection and compliance legislation for protection in an online environment. This is a law that I can get behind. And so in the United States, we have a lot of different things all coming our way, but don't forget that the GDPR still does apply to us.
Thanks for the update from the US, Grant. Let's look at the global picture. With this map that we've spent a long time creating. This took an age. It shows the state of data privacy regulations country by country as it was in May last year. This is May 2018. Those in orange have no data protection legislation at all. And those in blue are the ones with national legislation that's been around for a while and is looking a bit ragged around the edges. Green shows where the GDPR came into effect, and you'll notice just above Brazil, a little bit of green there, and that's French Guiana. That's on the east coast of South America because that's an overseas department of France, so it's actually covered by the GDPR. It's also worth mentioning a curious little fact here. During the peak month of May 2018, the acronym GDPR was searched more often on Google, this is true, than Beyonce or Kim Kardashian. That's probably a first and only, but it's a measure of the level of interest in the GDPR at the time. Now, the really intriguing part comes where you compare this map from May 2018 with the map from now, May 2019, to see what that interest led to. And this is it. Now, the countries in light green on your screen are those who now have GDPR-style legislation that follows much of the same principles and has the same expectations from businesses which handle personal data. The fun thing is when you flip back and forward to show just how much has changed. Watch this. Oh, see, it's like a light bulb just coming on everywhere. Now, in some countries like China, the law has already changed. In others like Brazil, it's about to change, so you do need to prepare for it. And with all of this in mind, there are 4 important things to remember. Firstly, every continent has been affected. Asia is now becoming dominated by GDPR-style legislation, for example. And how long do you think it will take Australia to join the party? Because New Zealand's new privacy bill becomes law in July. In South America, the big 3, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, they want a slice of the data privacy pie too. New laws are coming in. In Africa, 2 things here. South Africa and Egypt are ramping up their legislation, but something else is going on. Countries like Nigeria and Kenya are moving from having no data privacy laws to introducing them for the first time, not to the level of the GDPR, but they've also woken up to the need. So whichever country you do business in, you're likely to be affected in some way. Secondly, many countries are looking at the GDPR first, and they're often consulting the European Union about how to introduce their new legislation. It's becoming the benchmark, with countries then adding their own flavour to it, so expect more of the same. And thirdly, it's not confined to countries. Grant mentioned some acts, some bills, some states in the US. The California Consumer Privacy Act, that becomes effective January 1st, 2020. The other states wanting to follow California's example are, wait for it, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, Nevada, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Dakota, Rhode Island, this is a long list, and Texas. They all have proposed bills in the works. Washington has failed, but there's a lot more coming through. So even though the US is currently covered at a national level by a patchwork of relatively weak sector-specific laws, these new laws at a state level will have a significant impact on any business handling the personal data of residents in those states. And lastly, and importantly, this is a moving feast. It took us ages to put these maps together because sources like the DLA Piper Data Protection Handbook, which you can find online, they're good for country-by-country explanations of data privacy regulations, but they lag behind sometimes. So many countries are changing their laws. There's so much to keep track of. So whichever country you do business in, check the laws at a local level from multiple sources for small print variations. Now, these changes that we're seeing, they're not just due to the GDPR. It's a result of the misuse of data that we've talked about, the endless series of data breaches we've seen. Beyond Europe and US, all around the world, people have become worried, governments have become concerned, and businesses are now being called to account. Hence the map changing and new legislation being introduced everywhere. Some has been in the pipeline for years, and data privacy issues, as well as the GDPR, have been the catalyst that have encouraged governments to pass them into law, seemingly all at the same time. Fortunately, the one happy consequence is that if we look deep enough, we can see common strands emerging so that we can put plans in place that cover multiple laws all at the same time. So let's look at some of those. These are the common themes which businesses that trade across borders need to be aware of. Number one, the GDPR applies in more countries than you might think. It includes countries like Norway, which is outside the EU, but inside the European Economic Area. And it also includes EU-dependent countries and territories. We saw French Guiana earlier, just above Brazil. The island of Reunion, just off the coast of Africa. The GDPR applies there, believe it or not. Secondly, and this may surprise you, new legislation is being used in part to protect local businesses. In Russia, for example, the collection, storage and processing of the data of Russian citizens has to take place inside Russia. Similarly, there will be a requirement to keep sensitive and critical personal data in India only, and a further requirement for a mirror copy of personal data processed inside or outside the country also to be retained in India. There's so much to remember. Thirdly, this is going to hit businesses in the pocket because fines for non-compliance are rising steeply. Fail to comply with Brazil's new general data protection law, and you'll be facing a fine amounting to 2% of your gross sales, or a maximum sum of $12.9 million per infringement. Yeah, number four, borders are no excuse for non-compliance. A lot of new legislation follows the GDPR by ruling that any business which handles the personal data of citizens is required to comply, whether or not it's based in that country or state. Number five, the definition of personal data goes beyond the usual suspects. The GDPR included biometric data, identifiers like IP addresses, that's being copied. China expects web browsing histories to be protected. The California Consumer Privacy Act, and this is a first, that defines personal information as, quote, information that identifies, relates to, describes, is capable of being associated with, or could reasonably be linked directly or indirectly with the language, a particular consumer or household. They've made households also as important as people in terms of data privacy legislation. We'll see where that one leads. And finally, and this is a big one to actually remember, as businesses, we're now the guardians of data, not the owners of it. Phrases like informed consent, limited use, right to access, right to be forgotten, data breach notifications, they're in common use in data privacy and protection legislation everywhere. So the way businesses are accustomed to handling data has to change. Fortunately, we think there are 10 steps that you can take to be compliant everywhere. We spent the last half an hour or so talking about this whole new world of data protection. Truth is, the days that Grant talked about where DBAs were pretty much left to their own devices has gone. Almost every business will now need to comply in one form or another. Many will have to comply with multiple regulations. So what can you do to ensure you're compliant everywhere? We've identified 10 steps, ranging from identifying where and what your data is, to backing up every change and monitoring for compliance. As you can see, they break down rather neatly into 4 areas: understanding your data, protecting your data, introducing DevOps to your data, and watching over your data. So let's take a look at that important first step, understanding your data. Chris, take it away.
So this is a really interesting one, and one I really enjoy talking about, because actually data is not always how we expect it to be. Okay, whether that's the case of actually looking at the physical data itself and going, oh, I didn't expect those values in that column. The column has a very straightforward name, like column underscore new underscore needed this for new application underscore 1. Obviously proper naming conventions, and then it's got email addresses in it, and you're going, oh my goodness, why is this here? But it's not a case of starting with, well, let's have a look at the data in our tables. The first step is actually understanding where data is. Now, data can come in and it can move in lots of different ways. People talk about data at rest. I don't know much data that ever actually rests. Okay, what you need to understand is everywhere in your company that data is, everywhere that it goes. Okay, we're talking about data lineage, data movement, and actually identifying where you're creating copies, silos of this data. So whether you're a DBA and you're asked to, I don't know, back up and restore a database, maybe for development or testing purposes, and someone says to you, hey, can I get a copy of database X? Yes, absolutely not a problem. I'll restore it for you on some random server over here. But then maybe that DBA goes on holiday, or maybe there's a change, maybe that DBA moves on to some other job, someone with DBA-like responsibilities comes in, you form a new team, all of these sorts of reasons. And they come in and they go, right, where is our data? And they've kind of got a rough idea, you know, maybe they've kept some out-of-date Excel spreadsheet somewhere, again, which you might not even know where that is. But the key is that people aren't breaking into production systems, as Matt mentioned earlier. It's not a case of breaking in, cracking production open like a walnut. It's actually getting into someone's network or having unauthorized access to some copy of data that perhaps has been, oh no, kind of on the sly, restored somewhere, or maybe it's a discarded back file that they just sent you across the network. All of these sorts of things. And actually it's taking those, that's the big problem. And actually they can go out of date, but it still contains sensitive information. And you categorically cannot protect what you do not know is there. It's like playing capture the flag, except instead of having one flag, you have 100 flags, all of them are different colors all over the world, and you only think that there are 50 flags, yeah, you're going to struggle to play that game of capture the flag. The next one, identifying what your data is. So once you know where all of your data is, you've got a list, you know all these servers, all these databases, tables, etc. Figure out what's sensitive, what relates to individuals and households, as we know, thank you, CCPA. But if it's just headless, transactional, or publicly available data, well, maybe we don't have a reason to be quite so worried. But every single company will have some sensitive data. Now, I'm not just talking in terms of your online transaction processing workflows. I'm not just saying you gather customer information when you don't necessarily, but people have employee data, they have supplier data, they have customer data if they're so inclined to have customers. And the funny thing is that all of this data is stored somewhere, and you need to identify what parts of it are sensitive. So is it a name? Yes, well, that's probably sensitive. Is it an email address? That's probably sensitive. Is it a post or zip code? Is that sensitive? Interesting question, difficult to answer. Maybe yes, by correlation with other data.
Correlation.
Maybe no on its own. So when we were talking about what the nature of that data is, once you know where it is, you then have to identify it, because there are certain levels of protection that you may need for certain different types of data. A certain level of urgency and security may need to be placed around the most sensitive, and then having different kind of classifications. And this comes into having a good solid data cataloging process, actually understanding from an evergreen perspective what everything is, where it all is. And then once you know that, it's easy to identify where that risk lies, understanding how it moves, what it is, who uses it, where it goes, all of this, one big giant picture of how your data moves, is captured, is stored, is used, is processed. Then you can talk about the process and bake in that data protection by design. So yeah, as I say, once you know where your data is, what it is, you need to protect it. Grant, I know there are some native SQL Server features that can help here, but what else should businesses consider?
Okay, the next step that you need to do to ensure that you're compliant with the GDPR and those style laws is to reduce the attack surface area. Now, this is really hard work, and it means you've got to change the way you're doing security on your system. SA for everyone is no longer acceptable. That exposes way too much surface area, exposes way too much data, way too much functionality. Database owner for everyone is too much. You need to move to a least access methodology wherein you are only allowing people to get at the data that they should have, not all the information, not all of the stored procedures. This entails doing the work to set up the data appropriately, to set up your security appropriately, to ensure that you're protecting and reducing the surface area on the systems that you have under management. Further, you cannot simply store all the data in one big fat store anymore. In order to reduce the attack surface area, you need to distribute your data so that more sensitive information is in one place, less sensitive information is another, and only the necessary data gets transmitted across, and that way, again, you're reducing that attack surface area. Please, please remember that step. This one is so important. The next step is then masking data outside of production environments. The best data, ask any developer, is production data. But in this new compliance regime, we cannot allow production data into non-production environments. Therefore, we must mask our production data so that what we're putting into our non-production environments looks like, acts like, almost is, but isn't quite production data. It may be the same volume, but it's masked. We've hidden the email. We've hidden the credit card. We've hidden other private information so that people are not identifiable and we are not violating the laws, regulations coming our way. But This is also some difficult work because you cannot simply just replace the email with something else, because you want to make sure that you've got, a nice even distribution for your index. Maybe you search on emails. You can't simply replace the credit card with some random number, because credit cards have meaning, and depending on the application you're dealing with, you might be dealing with the fact that the last digit is a checksum. Also, the data distribution and the volume of data needs to mirror production. So the best methodology is to mask that data outside of production environments, with the understanding that that's a lot of work. And you're going to have to spend some time setting that up and dealing with that difficult task. More steps to come.
Thanks, Grant. Now, so far, we've talked about the work you need to identify and then protect your data, a lot of which will be the responsibility of the DBA and IT management. But once those safeguards are in place, the next step is to bake security and compliance into the normal day-to-day database development process. You try saying that. And that involves everyone. Fortunately, many IT teams have already made a head start, almost by default. Redgate's 2019 State of Database DevOps survey revealed that 77% of application developers are also responsible for developing the database. So the silos that existed a while ago, with the database being the thing down the corridor that was developed separately and solely by DBAs, they've largely gone away. That's encouraging, because it makes introducing DevOps to your data a lot easier. Don't be afraid here. DevOps is a kind of synonym for collaboration, cooperation. It's not full-blown DevOps, okay? The first step is to standardize team-based development. That's important because database languages like T-SQL are less strict than imperative coding languages like C# or Java. That's where the sequence and wording of each line of code is absolutely critical. Not so with T-SQL. As a result, developers who code T-SQL have their own preferred styles, lots of them, all of which can result in a lot of confusion, because when different developers work on the same code base, you've got different styles of code everywhere, and it all gets very, very confusing. Teams of developers can collaborate much more easily if all the code in the database is in the same style. Fortunately, tools like SQL Prompt from Redgate include a useful feature where users can code in the style they prefer, and then at the click of a mouse, change the code to a team standard style. That way, the speed at which developers' code isn't affected, but neither is the understanding of the whole body of code confused by lots of different styles in play. So once you're standardizing team-based development, the next step is to version control the code. Version control is standard pretty much in application development, and involves developers checking their changes into a common repository, preferably at the end of each working day. Database code can be version controlled in the same way, preferably by integrating with and plugging into the same version control system used for applications. That way, ad hoc changes and hotfixes are minimized, reducing the chance the database will drift from its expected state. Every developer works from the same single source of truth, so there are fewer errors in the development process. And crucially, an audit trail of who made what changes when and why is provided. Now, that can be useful in demonstrating compliance with data protection regulations. Version control also makes the third step, automating where possible. Every time a change is committed to version control, for example, you could trigger a continuous integration process to test the change and flag up any errors in the code. They can then be fixed, tested again before being passed along to a release management tool. This aligns with all the data privacy requirements that we've been talking about. It automates onerous tasks, it reduces errors, and it enables database updates to be delivered in a consistent, repeatable, and reliable way, and provides an audit trail of those changes. So organizations which introduce DevOps to data can do much of the work that makes them compliant with data protection regulations. Now, that's not the end of the story, because there are two tasks that are very familiar to DBAs, but which have also now become a crucial part of ensuring compliance, as Grant will explain right now.
Step number 9, backup every change. Now, the GDPR regulation does state that data loss is considered data breach. So backups are actually a fundamental part of your compliance process inside your systems, because if you lose the data, you may hit issues and you're going to have problems with GDPR compliance. So backups are extremely important. Now, backups are great, but restores are how we're measured. So you need to ensure that you can deliver the backup, that you can restore that. That means that not only are you doing backups, but to really be compliant, you also need to be doing backup testing to ensure that you can, in fact, restore that data. You can either mitigate or prevent data loss. You lose as little as possible or don't lose any. And backups are the mechanism that's going to help you protect that. Now, number 10, monitoring. You need to monitor for performance, certainly, but more importantly, you need to monitor for availability and you need to monitor for compliance. So you need to know that your servers are online. You need to know what kinds of changes are occurring inside your databases. Are people adding or dropping tables without your knowledge? Are modifications occurring to columns? Are permissions changing within the database without your knowledge? This monitoring must be put in place. Further, we're all dealing with a hybrid environment. Some of our stuff's in the cloud, some of our stuff is local. And yeah, sure, Azure gives you some monitoring capability with Azure SQL Database, Managed Instance, and the others, but it doesn't give you a complete picture. And that complete picture is separate from your local monitoring. So you're going to want to try to come to a place where you have a single pane of glass for the monitoring. You see all of your servers the same way, you see all of your databases the same way, and you're tracking the changes inside permissions, inside the database, inside those changes, such that you are not simply monitoring for performance, you're monitoring for availability, and more importantly, you're monitoring for compliance. Now that's 10 steps to try to hit the monitoring and compliance. Chris is going to come back and give us a complete summary.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Grant. So yeah, you've covered that. Backup every change, monitor for performance, and that is the 10 steps. Now, ever so slight disclaimer. Obviously, we're not lawyers. There's lots of different ways of interpreting these particular laws. As we say, worldwide, so many different laws with their own subtleties, but pulling out some of these key themes that Matt talked about earlier, we're able to really highlight the 10 steps that will help you, as I said earlier, build that defensible position. So understanding your data, where it is, what it is, where the risk lies. Protecting that data, reducing the attack surface, masking outside of production. If they don't need access to it, then they ain't getting access to it. Introduce DevOps, standardize that team-based development, the testing, the coding, make sure everyone is working in the same direction, in the same way. Keep everything in version control and audit that process, and of course, automate where possible. Finally, have an eye on the whole process. Back it up and monitor it at all times. So if you do follow these steps, what will the result be? Well, there's many advantages to be gained. You'll understand your data, and that's more than we can say for most people, right? We don't all understand. I don't understand my data, but you'll understand your data. You'll know how to protect it, and you will do so. And it will enable you to protect it in the most robust, reliable way, such that even if issues occur, you have a process for that. You have a fallback. You'll know when, why, and how breaches occur. Again, you need to be able to, under the GDPR, you need to be able to say within 72 hours if you've had a breach and you've noticed it, you then have to declare it to the relevant body. And the good thing is that helps you then mitigate that for the future. If you minimize all the potential possibilities, then the chances of it happening are lessened. You'll be able to respond immediately. Responding is so important, being able to respond with the level of urgency that something like that deserves. Actually moving with that speed, it isn't just a DevOps thing. You should be moving with that level of speed and urgency for everything that demands it of you. Ultimately, you'll be able to demonstrate compliance everywhere. Those headache questions that you get asked of how is this data being used, who has access to it, you will know the answers. You'll have the answers to those audits so that when people come in and ask these questions of you, you can sit back and not worry. And that's the 10 steps.
There we go.
Thanks so much, guys. That was amazing. I personally learned a lot from that, and I hope everyone else did. Everyone else did too. Thanks everyone for your questions that have come in throughout the session. We hope we've managed to answer most of those as we've gone through, but we'll do our best to get back to you on those as well. So coming up next on the Pass Data Marathon, we have Martin Catherall with data privacy and the data-driven professional. So stay tuned and make sure you check that session out. But for now, everyone, thanks so much for attending. And remember, learn more at red-gate.com/data privacy.